King Henry VIII was not one of those monarchs who believed they would live forever. The sources clearly show that he was acutely aware of his mortality, and there are signs he may have even longed for death, as he suffered from debilitating leg pain for many years. On multiple occasions, it seemed this ailment might claim his life. In his final years, Henry focused intently on preparing for the future of his kingdom after his death, while also being deeply concerned with his personal salvation. We will explore these preparations in detail later in the video. It is particularly interesting to note that Henry appears to have consciously relied on his eldest daughter, Mary, during his later years. The sources suggest their relationship was far closer than has generally been recognized. It seems that Mary may have reciprocated the trust and affection her father showed her. Now, I understand that some viewers might be feeling frustrated and ready to stop watching the video. I assure you, I will defend my statements with evidence from the sources. To be clear, I do not deny that Mary was a victim of her father's abuse. She endured terrible suffering at his hands. However, this does not negate the fact that, when given the opportunity, she may have gratefully embraced the chance to work alongside him. I must also acknowledge that my research for this video was somewhat limited. A more thorough investigation, particularly by Mary's biographers, is sorely needed. Unfortunately, there is a significant gap in the scholarship regarding this aspect of her life. But let's start at the beginning. Historians generally divide Henry VIII and Mary's relationship into three distinct phases. In the first phase, Henry was a loving father who even seriously considered naming Mary as his heir. David Starkey provides a vivid glimpse of their relationship in this excerpt. The king ordered the princess, who had just celebrated her second birthday, to be brought in. Solemnly, Wolsey, Ambassador Giustiniani, and the attendant lords kissed the child's hand. Then, Mary caught sight of Friar Dionysius Memo, the great Venetian organist, who was then resident keyboard virtuoso at Henry's court. "Priest, priest," she commenced calling out in English and would not stop until Memo agreed to play for her. Henry was delighted at the display, which showed that Mary was, in truth, her father's daughter, musical, precocious, and imperious, far beyond her years. The second phase of their relationship marks Henry's estrangement from his eldest daughter, lasting from 1531 to 1537. During this period, Henry famously referred to Mary as his greatest enemy. It was a tumultuous time, defined by the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn. Mary's half-sister Elizabeth was born and declared heir, only to later lose her inheritance and legitimacy as Mary had before. It was during this phase that Mary first experienced serious health problems. Although Henry sent his doctors to attend to her, he refused any personal contact. The two saw each other only once from a distance, yet they treated each other with respect. Mary bowed to her father, and Henry acknowledged her. Mary had hoped their relationship would improve following Anne Boleyn's death. However, Henry continued to demand that she submit to his authority, recognize him as the head of the church, and accept her own illegitimacy. Mary eventually complied in the summer of 1536, but this submission came at a personal cost. She was even required to write letters to her Habsburg relatives explaining her decision. By 1537, the ordeal was over, and many historians describe Henry and Mary's relationship as relatively stable from that point until his death. After her submission, Mary was able to live in relative peace. The prevailing impression is that Henry's eldest daughter was simply enduring her circumstances, waiting for the day when her father would finally pass. In the meantime, Mary continued to practice her Catholic faith privately and cared for her younger siblings. However, Historians do not entirely agree on how to characterize the third phase of Mary and Henry's relationship. Linda Porter, for instance, refers to these years as the quiet years. Jean Mary Stone, writing at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, described Mary as the desire of all eyes. John Edwards chose the words Mary bereaved, while Melita Thomas cites a tender remark from Henry, mine own good daughter. The focus of most accounts is on the years 1537 to 1543. During this period, Mary became Edward's godmother, played a key role in Jane Seymour's funeral, and then faded somewhat from the foreground. She grew closer to Anne of Cleves, who was only a year older than Mary, while maintaining a distant, if not openly hostile attitude toward Catherine Howard. After this, most narratives briefly mention that Mary attended her father's wedding to Catherine Parr in July 1543, took on duties as a hostess at court, and developed a friendly relationship with the new queen. Additionally, her name appears in connection with the 1544 Succession Act, which placed her second in line to the throne. To quantify the attention given to this phase, John Edwards, in his biography of Mary, devotes 26 pages to this period, but only 3/4 of a page covers the years from 1543 to 1547. I show this page on the screen. While other biographies may not be quite as brief, they follow a similar pattern. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, this lack of detail is concerning, as important facts are often overlooked. Mary not only returned to court, but became one of Henry's principal heirs. His will made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the kingdom, and she was frequently involved in marriage negotiations. By 1543, and for some time afterward, Mary didn't even have her own household, residing at court instead. This can be inferred from records showing that doctors treated her there for her ongoing health problems. Contrary to what some may suggest, Mary's relationship with her father was far from stable between 1537 and 1547. At the outset, she continued to suffer under his rule. When she first returned to court, Henry greeted her with the chilling statement that many of his advisors had wanted him to have her executed. Mary, understandably, fainted at these words. This was not only a barely veiled threat, but also a reminder of an earlier incident in which her father's emissaries threatened to smash her head against a wall if she did not submit to Henry's authority. Financially, Henry kept her on a tight leash. We know from a letter Mary wrote to Thomas Cromwell that she received only £40 every 3 months, barely enough to support her household. She even had to beg for extra money at Christmas to cover seasonal expenses. To put this in perspective, when Henry first spoke to Mary in the presence of Jane Seymour after 5 years of estrangement, he gave her £250 on the spot. Regarding her relationship with Catherine Howard, Mary's rejection of her is often attributed to disgust at her father marrying such a young woman. Mary likely had a low opinion of Catherine's character and intelligence, and the fact that Catherine was related to Anne Boleyn did not help matters. While I do not dismiss these factors, I want to suggest an additional perspective. Catherine Howard became queen at roughly the same age that Mary had been when she was cast out of court. Catherine received everything Mary had once been promised, but was brutally denied. Setting aside the intimate aspects of Catherine and Henry's relationship, it must have seemed to Mary that someone she viewed as unworthy was living the life she had long dreamed of, while she herself wasn't even permitted to marry. In traditional depictions, it is often suggested that Mary withdrew into the private sphere during her later years, with many assuming that she gradually became the Catholic fanatic she is often remembered as. The reasoning behind this view is that her father continually disappointed her, offering her at best a peaceful but restricted life. Consequently, it is believed that Mary increasingly modeled herself after her mother, Catherine of Aragon, who in her final years found solace only in her faith. Mary, it is said, followed her mother's example in this regard. However, there are several problems with this interpretation. For instance, when Henry VIII forced Mary to submit to his will, her Habsburg relatives attempted to secure papal absolution for her, but the Pope refused. This means that at one point, Mary had defied the Pope. While this relationship would later normalize after Henry's death, it presented a complication at the time. In fact, the sources for the years 1543 to 1547 show Mary as far more active than this traditional narrative suggests. I will display the extensive evidence that documents her marriage prospects during these years. For example, we learn that she spoke with one potential suitor for over an hour. Although she was indisposed, indicating her active participation in these discussions. Mary had public duties and fulfilled them faithfully. For example, she was godmother to Charles Brandon's widow, Catherine Willoughby. Mary therefore repeatedly received warrants for special clothing. 3 examples from the sources warrant particular attention. First, we find a note indicating that neither the Queen nor Mary were allowed to see Henry when he was suffering from particularly severe symptoms caused by his leg. The special mention of this restriction implies that, under normal circumstances, both Catherine Parr and Mary had regular access to the king, even when he was unwell. Secondly, we learn that Mary's household became a refuge for young women who wanted to live in piety and devotion. According to John Edwards, Mary held such a prestigious position, both domestically and internationally, that the Privy Council kept a close watch on her. However, her ability to act so independently suggests that she had the king's approval. The fact that the council could do little more than monitor her also indicates that her position at court was secure. Thirdly, an intriguing protocol adjustment emerges in the sources to reflect Mary's status. Although the Queen was officially the highest-ranking woman in England, Anne of Cleves was supposed to take the second rank as the king's sister. Meanwhile, both Mary and Elizabeth were technically considered illegitimate. However, when it came to accommodation at court, a distinction was made between ordinary and extraordinary status. Mary held the highest rank in the ordinary category, while Anne of Cleves led the extraordinary category. One reason for this was that Anne and the other women in the extraordinary group did not reside at court permanently. This arrangement allowed Mary to hold a rank equivalent to Anne's despite her technical illegitimacy. Let us now turn our attention back to Henry VIII. In the final years of his life, he appeared to become more aligned with Catholic beliefs. In 2023, Canadian literature professor Micheline White made headlines when she discovered a prayer book belonging to Henry that could not have been written before 1544. The Tudor king had personally marked 14 passages, indicating they held particular significance for him. For instance, one passage, likely related to his leg injury, was marked by Henry. "Take away thy plagues from me, for thy punishment hath made me both feeble and faint. For when thou chastisest a man for his sins, thou causest him by and by to consume and pine away." Another marked passage suggests that Henry was seeking more divine grace than he felt his sins warranted. He highlighted this statement, "O Lord God, forsake me not, although I have done no good in thy sight." These selections reveal Henry's deep concern about how God would judge him, so much so that he made markings in the book to easily locate these relevant passages again. In a previous video specifically focused on this prayer book, I mentioned that these markings had led to speculation that Henry may have regretted the executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. However, I would now like to suggest that they may have also been about Mary. By this time, Mary had secured a permanent place at court, and Henry clearly trusted her, as he allowed her to participate in public engagements. She played a central role as a maternal figure for her half-siblings, Edward and Elizabeth, offering them stability during a time when queens frequently came and went. Mary had taken on this responsibility, sometimes even forcibly, when her half-siblings were still young. Religiously, Mary's views closely mirrored those of her father in his later years. She remained devoutly Catholic, adhering strictly to the Church's customs. The fact that Henry codified Catholic practices and persecuted Protestants was something that Mary strongly approved of. Mary's biographer, Melita Thomas, offered a compelling perspective. Henry and Mary had two parallel relationships, one personal, as father and daughter, and the other political, as king and potential heir. It was the political relationship that deteriorated, ultimately pulling their personal bond down with it. During Henry's final years, father and daughter once again aligned politically. Mary had no issues with Catherine Parr, even referring to her as mother in a letter a year after Henry's death. Her positive personal relationship with the Protestant Anne of Cleves also demonstrates that Mary was capable of overlooking religious differences when it came to maintaining harmonious relationships. Mary fully supported her father's plans for her, including the potential marriage negotiations he pursued on her behalf. While it's uncertain how viable these individual marriage candidates were, the key point is that Mary was actively involved and held a prominent position at court. Her reinstatement in the line of succession and her inclusion in Henry's will, where she was made one of the wealthiest people in the kingdom, formalized this prominence. Given this, an important question arises. How much influence did Mary have over her father? Could she have encouraged him to adopt more conservative religious views in his final years? Did he allow her to establish a household that became a refuge for young Catholic women because he saw her as a moral role model, one that he himself could no longer be? It's also worth asking whether Henry sought her political advice, perhaps leading to the extensive marriage negotiations he pursued, which explored various alliance options for England. After Henry's death, Mary withdrew from court and became politically isolated, reacting increasingly hostilely toward her half-brother Edward's staunchly Protestant government. But perhaps the rift wasn't solely due to religious differences. Could it be that Mary's frustrations also stemmed from the fact that she had played an important political role just before Henry's death, but was now sidelined? I don't believe any of the questions raised can be answered with a definitive yes. I'm not suggesting that Mary was her father's right-hand confidant or that she rose to become the Cromwell of Henry's final years. However, I do believe that this period, and Mary's role in it, requires a fundamental reassessment. It is clear she was far from passive or simply grieving. Mary had become an important and stable presence at court. Exactly what that entailed deserves deeper investigation. Unfortunately, I cannot provide that level of analysis here. Still, I strongly advise against viewing her as a passive figure, merely waiting for her father to die, or as someone consumed with hatred towards him, even though she had every reason to feel that way. The truth is much more nuanced. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.